Late 1942. That is when the whispers began. Rumors circulated through the streets of Germany that the invincible Sixth Army was trapped. General Paulus was surrounded in Stalingrad. Citizens, addicted to news of constant victories, refused to believe the Wehrmacht's largest formation was doomed, but the doubt remained. Joseph Goebbels took to the airwaves. He announced a German Christmas, defined not by joy, but by austerity and hardness. 2 years passed. By Christmas 1944, the capital was a graveyard. Allied bombers had reduced Berlin to a skeleton of jagged concrete and twisted steel. Rations were scarce, stress was constant, the people were exhausted, and their humor turned pitch black. It wasn't just cynicism, it was a coping mechanism. One popular joke suggested the most practical gift for the holidays was a coffin. The landscape of the city changed. Messages appeared on the walls of collapsed buildings. Hand-scrawled notes told relatives, "We are alive," or "We have moved." Above these desperate signs, the Nazi Party posted their own warnings. They were blunt. Looters will be punished by death. The sirens never seemed to stop. Berliners spent more hours in damp basements than in their own beds. The underground shelters were suffocating. The footage captures the scene, crowded bodies huddled under dim blue lights. The atmosphere was claustrophobic. Men and women wore their heaviest coats, clutching small cardboard suitcases. Inside were their last treasures, a sandwich, a thermos, vital papers. The ceilings were coated in luminous paint. When the power inevitably failed, the paint glowed in the dark like a ghost, guiding the terrified populace. But there wasn't enough room. Berlin had a population of 3 million. The bunkers were overflowing. Why did they laugh in the face of annihilation? Because terror requires a release valve. The official acronym for an air raid shelter was LSR. The people gave it a new meaning. Learn schnell Russisch. Learn Russian quickly. The streets reflected this shift. The stiff-armed Heil Hitler vanished from daily life. Instead, citizens greeted one another with 2 grim words. Bleib übrig. Survive. Fear of the East paralyzed the population. Goebbels' propaganda machine worked overtime. He broadcast graphic reports from Nemmersdorf. He detailed how Red Army troops raped and murdered hundreds of civilians. The strategy worked. The fear was absolute. The arrival of the Soviets felt like an inevitable apocalypse. Then came December 1944. The Ardennes offensive. It brought a sudden, dangerous spike in morale. Civilians began to believe again. They whispered about the Führer's genius and promised miracle weapons. They thought they could still hold the world hostage. At first glance, a masterstroke of military resilience. But in reality, a suicide mission for the Wehrmacht. The High Command saw what the people did not. Staff officers knew that attacking in the West would drain the Eastern Front at the most critical moment. But Hitler was obsessed. He wanted to reverse the war's fortune and force the Allies to negotiate. He refused to even look at a map of the Soviet Union. General Guderian tried to intervene. He warned Hitler about the massive buildup of Red Army forces. He presented the numbers. The dictator didn't listen. He dismissed the estimates as rubbish and impostures. He was convinced the Soviet divisions were weak. He kept his eyes locked on the West, ignoring the storm gathering behind him. January 13, 1945. The time for delusions ran out. The Red Army did not wait. They launched a massive artillery barrage that shook the earth. The Vistula-Oder offensive began. The Soviet forces were no longer just a rumor or a dot on a map. They were an avalanche. The front lines collapsed. The Red Army was at the gate. January 13, 1945. On this day, General Ivan Chernyakhovsky gave the order to open fire. Artillery tore through the winter silence of East Prussia. The Soviet troops received a clear message before the attack. They were entering the den of the fascist beast. Mercy was not part of the plan. The Germans fought back fiercely, but the momentum was unstoppable. By January 24th, Soviet tank treads were grinding the pavement at the gates of Königsberg. Events accelerated. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky struck from the south on January 14th. His goal was simple: cut off East Prussia from the rest of the Reich. German General Georg Hans Reinhardt saw the map. He saw the trap closing. He immediately warned Hitler about the catastrophe. But Berlin remained silent. The warning was ignored. The Soviet advance caught the Wehrmacht off guard, and the front line collapsed. But the real chaos was orchestrated by one man. Gauleiter Erich Koch, the Nazi leader of the region, held the fate of millions in his hands. He refused to evacuate civilians. He forbade preparations. Even worse, he made a fatal error in logistics. Koch sent trains full of refugees not to safety, but directly into areas already captured by the Soviets. Civilians drove straight into the line of fire, but Koch did not share their fate. When the Red Army approached his headquarters, he didn't organize a defense. He packed his bags. He fled. The population was left alone to face the vengeance of the East. The escape turned into a nightmare. Frostbite killed thousands. Snowdrifts buried carts and bodies. In one village, the NKVD stumbled upon a horrific scene. The report describes 100 female bodies scattered in the snow. 6-pointed stars were sewn onto their clothes. These were prisoners of a death march, executed point blank by retreating guards. But the violence did not end there. As the Red Army advanced, restraint vanished. Rapes, looting, and murders became systemic. Soviet commanders issued orders to maintain discipline. But these papers meant nothing to soldiers fueled by adrenaline and alcohol. Why did discipline break down so completely? The officers tried to intervene, but the rage of the soldiers was stronger than the threat of court-martial. They entered German homes and froze in shock. They saw electricity, clean linens, porcelain, and order. At first glance, a wealthy, civilized life. But in reality, a trigger for blind hatred. The soldiers asked a simple question: why did these people live so well after burning down Russia? Shock turned to fury. They smashed mirrors, they ripped paintings. What they could not carry, they burned. Political officers and censors tried to hide the scale of the chaos. They blocked letters and silenced reports. But they could not control the actions on the ground. 8.5 million people abandoned everything. Between January and mid-February, a human flood moved west. East Prussia, a region deeply tied to German history, was being erased from the map. For the Soviet soldier, the equation was simple. The war had returned to its source. They remembered the ashes of Belarus and Ukraine. Now they brought those ashes to German soil. By late January, the debt was being collected. Revenge was the only currency. The Red Army didn't just want victory, they wanted retribution. By late January 1945, Berlin collapsed into hysteria. Sirens screamed every night. It wasn't just noise, it was a countdown. Refugees flooded the train stations. They didn't bring luggage. They brought horror stories about what was coming from the east. The map was turning red. Hungary, a key ally, switched flags and joined the Soviet Union. Rumors spread faster than fire. The Eastern Front was dissolving. Railroad workers saw the empty tracks and knew more than the general staff. But official channels lied. Why did they risk death for news? The penalty for listening to foreign radio was execution. But the need for truth was stronger than the fear of the Gestapo. People huddled under blankets, tuning into the BBC to hear the reality of their doom. Some clung to a desperate hope. They prayed the Soviets would only kill the SS and spare the workers. At first glance, life continued, but in reality, survival became a job. Public transportation still rattled down the streets. Civilians struggled to reach factories. Many stopped going home entirely. They slept on cold concrete floors near their machines to avoid the dangerous commute. They stockpiled food for relatives whose homes were already rubble. Those with money called in favors. They tried to slip out of the capital before the trap snapped shut. Goebbels stopped them. He declared that leaving Berlin without permission was desertion. The footage shows SS squads patrolling the intersections looking for stragglers. Executions spiked. Himmler signed the orders. On January 23rd, the hangman finished the job. Members of the resistance linked to the July plot were executed. Goebbels plastered the walls with slogans, "We will win because we must win." But ink on paper could not stop tanks. The people read the posters and looked at the sky. Hitler was a ghost. He rarely left the bunker. Officers who entered the Reich Chancellery saw a broken shell. The camera records, a man with a stooped back and a trembling left hand. The once powerful leader looked like a senile old man. Paranoia consumed him. He saw a traitor in every uniform. He trusted no one. Meanwhile, the map changed daily. Marshal Ivan Konev's first Ukrainian front surged forward. They captured Krakow. They took Radom. The German 17th Army panicked. They didn't retreat. They ran to the Oder River. Marshal Georgy Zhukov raced toward the prize. The first Belarusian front targeted Berlin, but politics intervened. Stalin ordered a halt. He wanted Zhukov to wait for Rokossovsky's forces to catch up. Zhukov pushed back. He argued against the delay. His tanks rolled through Wutherland. German resistance there had evaporated. But this was only the beginning. Where the fighting continued, mercy vanished. The Polish desire for vengeance was total. Soviet forces showed no restraint toward German civilians. February 23rd. Poznan fell. Soviet armor crushed the city. The noise of battle drifted toward Berlin. Troops reached the Oder River. They established bridgeheads near Kustrin. The Wehrmacht was caught off guard. The speed of the onslaught paralyzed them. Defense lines were non-existent. It was a matter of weeks. The Soviet boot was poised to enter the Nazi capital. The city waited for the fire. April 20th, 1945. Adolf Hitler turned 56. The gunners of the First Belarusian Front prepared a specific kind of birthday candle. Thousands of artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The ground shook. This was not a salute. It was the beginning of the end. The shelling of Berlin began that morning and did not cease for a single minute until the capital surrendered. 3 days passed. A Soviet newspaper printed a short headline. Their soldiers were already walking the streets of Berlin. Why did Hitler stay in the city? He had the means to escape. But the dictator chose to remain in the bunker to give the battle a mythical, European significance. For the civilians trembling in cellars, these ideological abstractions meant nothing. Survival was the only metric. At first glance, a sturdy shelter, but in reality, a concrete coffin. The bunker at Anhalter Bahnhof stood next to the main railway station. It was a massive fortress of steel and concrete, 3 floors above ground, 2 floors buried deep in the earth. The walls were 4.5 meters thick, designed to withstand direct hits. But the engineering could not account for the human flood. 12,000 people crammed into 3,600 square meters. The math was brutal. There was no space to lie down. There was barely space to stand. The crowd was so dense that reaching the lavatories became physically impossible. The footage shows people standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale in the dim light. One woman sat on the same concrete step for 6 days. She did not move. She could not move. Hygiene collapsed entirely. The smell of sweat, waste, and fear filled the air. But sanitation was a secondary problem. The taps were dry. The city's water supply had been severed by the artillery barrages. Thirst became more dangerous than the bombs. A single water pump remained operational outside the station entrance. It became a zone of death. Young women grabbed buckets and sprinted into the open. Shrapnel flew. Snipers watched the square. To fetch water was to gamble with life. Those who returned with full buckets were treated like heroes. They held the power of life for the elderly and the wounded who remained in the dark. Morale collapsed. The German soldiers were no longer the disciplined machine of 1940. Their eyes were hollow. Officers tore off their insignia. They found civilian clothes in abandoned apartments and changed quickly. Desertion was no longer a crime. It was a survival strategy. But for the teenagers in uniform, a different kind of panic set in. They knew the stories. They knew the enemy was coming. Many young soldiers were virgins, and the prospect of dying without knowing a woman terrified them. The girls of Berlin faced a darker equation. They feared the arrival of Soviet troops. They feared mass assault. In the dark basements, a frantic exchange began. Girls gave themselves to the German boys. It was not romance. It was a desperate attempt to control their own bodies one last time before the conquerors arrived. A Norwegian journalist recorded the scene. Uniforms unbuttoned in the shadows, a frantic search for pleasure amidst the ruin. But this was only the beginning of the chaos. Order dissolved, looting became widespread. Gerda Peterson, a young secretary, saw a Luftwaffe ration cart abandoned in the street. She didn't hesitate. She joined a gang of women tearing at the supplies. They grabbed boxes, fighting for food. Suddenly, the roar of engines. Soviet planes dropped from the clouds. Machine guns strafed the street. Bullets kicked up dust and concrete. Gerda didn't run. She slid under the cart, pressing her face into the dirt. The camera records a woman running with a package of toilet paper. A bullet struck her. She fell instantly. Gerda watched her die. It was a strange, undignified death. To be killed for a roll of paper while the city burned. The power grid failed completely. Darkness swallowed Berlin. With the radios silent, rumors replaced news. False stories traveled fast from cellar to cellar. Some said an army from the West was coming to save them. Others said the war was already over. Nazi propaganda screamed for resistance to the last drop of blood. But the paper war had turned. Soviet planes dropped millions of leaflets. They were simple and direct. They told German soldiers that fighting was useless. The message worked. German troops did not burn these papers. They hid them in their pockets. When they surrendered, they held the leaflets up like tickets to safety. Soviet propagandists then targeted the women. New flyers fell from the sky. They promised safety. They urged the women to convince their husbands and sons to lay down their arms. They promised that no harm would come to the civilians. But the women of Berlin did not believe the paper promises. They knew what happens when a conquering army enters a hated city. The fear of sexual violence was absolute. The hope for a miracle weapon or a political rescue had vanished. The illusion was gone. From the east and southeast, the tanks rolled in. The city waited for the inevitable. 1.5 million soldiers. That was the sheer weight of the Soviet force bearing down on the German capital. Advancing from the east and southeast, the Red Army tightened the noose. General Helmut Weidling stood in their way. He commanded a defensive force of 45,000 men. It was a desperate mix, hardened Wehrmacht veterans fighting alongside fanatical SS officers, and next to them, the Volkssturm. Old men and teenagers armed with Panzerfausts and terror. The math was simple: 30 attackers for every one defender. The battle for the city center raged, but deep underground, Adolf Hitler refused to look at the maps. He remained in his bunker, moving phantom armies that no longer existed. He believed the tide would turn. It was a delusion. Why did Hitler order the destruction of his own capital? It seemed like madness, but in the bunker, logic had been replaced by spite. He issued the Nero Decree, Deutsche Reich. If the Reich was to fall, nothing of value should remain for the enemy. Bridges were blown, food warehouses were torched. Then came the order to flood the subway tunnels. Thousands of civilians were hiding there, families seeking refuge from the relentless artillery barrage. The charges detonated. The water rushed in. In the dark, panic took hold. The screams were drowned out by the torrent. It was not a tactical move. It was mass murder of his own people. Above ground, the chaos intensified. Soviet tanks rolled over the barricades. With each passing day, the resistance fractured. Exhausted defenders retreated or died where they stood. The city turned into a graveyard of concrete and iron. The footage shows streets choked with rubble and burning vehicles. What was once a proud metropolis was falling apart. The last lines of defense fought with suicidal bravery, but it was futile. May 2nd, early morning, Soviet boots kicked open the doors of the Reich Chancellery. The heart of the regime stopped beating. That same day, soldiers climbed the ruined dome of the Reichstag. The red flag snapped in the wind against a smoke-filled sky. Berlin had fallen. The Third Reich was dead. For the Soviet troops, it was a moment of euphoria. The long war was finally over. Victory was absolute. At first glance, a celebration of justice, but in reality, the beginning of a lawless nightmare. The joy quickly curdled into aggression. Discipline evaporated. The men had seen too much death on the road from Stalingrad. Now they wanted payment. Alcohol became the fuel for the fire. Soldiers found wine cellars and industrial spirits. They consumed unusually large amounts of liquor. Drunkenness swept through the ranks like a plague. Political commissars shouted orders. They tried to control the army, but it was impossible. No one listened. Singing and dancing turned into rioting. Groups of soldiers roamed the streets. They kicked down apartment doors in search of watches, food, and alcohol. But they didn't stop at robbery. The violence escalated. Soviet soldiers stormed houses. They killed the occupants without hesitation. Even surrender was no guarantee of survival. German soldiers and Volkssturm members waved white flags. The response was often a burst of machine gun fire. They were gunned down where they stood. The situation worsened with every hour. It is worth mentioning that not every soldier was a monster. There were exceptions. One sapper detachment entered a ruined apartment. Inside, they found a sick woman terrified for her life. They didn't hurt her. They gave her food rations and left. But these were rare sparks in the dark. The general treatment of Berliners was brutal. It went beyond the bounds of war. Although the combat had ceased, the suffering of the civilians peaked, especially for the women. There was no police to call. There was nowhere to run. It was a brutal reprisal. Thousands of wooden signs lined the eastern border. They carried a single brutal message for the invading army. "Soldier, you are in Germany. Take revenge on the Hitlerites." It was not just a slogan, it was a direct command. The Red Army marched into enemy territory with this order burning in their minds. Mercy was not an option. They viewed the entire population as targets. This included the most vulnerable. Women became the primary object of their retribution. Why did the violence wait? For the first 72 hours after the fall of Berlin, the city remained relatively calm. The Soviet soldiers were busy. They chased the remnants of the Wehrmacht through the rubble. They secured strategic sectors. Civilians took advantage of this brief pause. They looted food storage centers. They scavenged for coal in the ruins. They believed the worst was over. But this was a false calm. On the fourth day, the discipline collapsed. An uninterrupted chain of looting and sexual violence began. Alcohol fueled the chaos. The Soviets targeted women of every age, young girls, elderly grandmothers. It did not matter if they were Nazi party members or innocent civilians. The footage creates a grim picture. Bottles of schnapps littering the streets and soldiers staggering through the dust. Drunkenness made the violence unpredictable and severe. The soldiers did not look for shadows or private rooms. They committed these crimes openly. They attacked women in the shells of bombed-out apartments. They attacked them on the sidewalks. Often they forced families to watch. Husbands and fathers stood helpless at gunpoint. At first glance, a military occupation, but in reality, a systematic purge. This trauma was just one layer of the catastrophe. These women had already lost their homes to Allied bombers. They had lost sons and husbands to the front lines. They suffered from malnutrition and disease. Now, sexual assault became another routine survival metric in a devastated Germany. An observer noted a chilling fact. Rape had become routine. Margaret Bovary, a German journalist, documented the horror in her diary. Her entry from May 8, 1945, captures the surreal atmosphere. She rode a bicycle alongside a young girl. The girl was disheveled. She had been a prisoner of the Russians for 14 days. She was well fed, but she had been repeatedly violated. Bovary wrote with cold detachment, "The usual rapes occurred. Resistance meant death." Bovary noted that a neighbor tried to fight back. The soldiers shot her immediately. Another woman, Mrs. Krauss, escaped unharmed. She insisted the Russians avoided women who wore glasses. Bovary questioned if this absurd rule was true. The troops were intoxicated, but they began to distinguish between the young and the old. Bovary called this progress. Even those who welcomed the Soviets faced betrayals. Jews and anti-fascists emerged from hiding places. They expected liberation. They found danger. Inga Deutschkron had survived the war in a basement with her mother. When she heard the rumble of Russian tanks, she felt joy. She ran out to greet the liberators, but the scene turned instantly. A soldier approached her. He smiled, then he grabbed her clothes. His voice was low and slurred. "Come, Frau, come." Inga pulled away. She ran back to her mother. Her mother sighed heavily. So it is true after all. They held out their Jewish identity cards like shields. They hoped their status as victims would protect them. It did not work. The soldiers could not read the German text. To the invaders, they were simply Germans. May 1945. At that time, the danger did not stay on the streets. Soviet soldiers breached the perimeter. They descended into the bunkers. They kicked open the doors of basements. There, civilians hid from the artillery fire and the bombs. But they could not hide from the infantry. The soldiers raped women in front of their children. They raped women in front of their husbands. Sometimes they selected victims based on preference. Other times, it was a gang assault. Age was not a shield. 70-year-old grandmothers, young girls who had not yet finished school. The soldiers targeted them all indiscriminately. The first anti-fascist mayor of Charlottenburg recorded the descent into chaos. At first, the Russians looted. They stripped individuals of watches and rings. They emptied warehouses and stores. But this was only the beginning. It got worse. Robbery turned into sexual violence. Countless cases occurred daily. A woman outside a hiding spot was a target. A woman inside a hiding spot was a prisoner. The scale of the violence is difficult to quantify, but the pattern was clear. First, the rape in the bunker. Then, relentless looting. Then, they moved up to the apartments for more victims. Germans flooded the local government with reports. One police file stands out. It was sent to the Rathaus Spandau. Later, it reached the Soviet commander. The date, May 6, 1945. The time, 2:30 in the morning. The sound of shattering glass broke the silence. 3 Russian soldiers smashed a window in the hallway. They did not knock. They forced a tenant to open the main door. They moved room by room. On the second floor, they found their target. 2 young women were asleep. A baby lay between them. The soldiers did not attack immediately. They sat on the bed. They lit cigarettes. The smell of tobacco smoke filled the small room. Then came the demands. They ordered the women to sleep with them. One woman tried to scream. The reaction was instant. The soldiers raised their weapons. The other woman called out for her mother. It was a mistake. A soldier grabbed her. He forced her into the next room. He held her there with a machine gun pointed at her chest. He did not rape her yet. He searched the suitcases for valuables. Meanwhile, in the bedroom, the other 2 soldiers raped the woman who had stayed behind. Extreme violence became the new normal. A petition from Berlin-Reinickendorf provides another grim snapshot. The document is dated June 28th. It describes an attack from May 4th. 2 Russian soldiers arrived. They were drunk. They attacked a married couple. The wife was 62 years old. The husband was 66. The husband tried to intervene. The soldiers shot him dead. Then, both men raped the 62-year-old widow next to her husband's corpse. But the horror did not end there. Later, a 3rd Russian soldier entered the apartment. He ignored the body on the floor. He raped the woman again. In her report, the woman noted a tragic detail. Her husband was not a Nazi. He belonged to no organization. She requested a hearing. She wanted justice. But the city was in ruins. Swiss journalist Max Schnitzer kept a diary. He witnessed the apocalypse in the Dahlem district. The visuals he describes are harrowing. In one scene, a father tries to protect his daughter, a little girl. The soldiers do not hesitate. They drive a 3-edged bayonet into the man's stomach. In another scene, soldiers line up by the dozens. They wait their turn for a solitary woman. The frenzy is total. They do not notice that the women are dying under them. Some victims swallowed poison. Others suffered internal hemorrhaging. The soldiers did not stop. The footage of memory shows resistance is futile. Women bit and scratched. The soldiers struck them on the head with rifle butts. Men threw themselves at the aggressors. They were shot immediately. The chase moved outside. Women and girls ran through gardens. They sprinted down the streets. They climbed to the rooftops. To save their honor, many leaped to their deaths. Those who were cornered in rooms faced a different torture. Soldiers forced their mouths open. They poured high-proof alcohol down their throats until the women passed out. At first glance, pure monsters. But in reality, it was more complex. Schnitzer notes a strange paradox. Not every Russian soldier was a rapist. A colleague described the fighting in Wannsee with a chilling formula. In part like pigs, in part like angels. In one apartment, a woman dies from abuse. In the next house, the Russians act like friends. They are like a hailstorm. It destroys half the harvest, but leaves the rest untouched. Reports of brutal rape mix with stories of sudden kindness. In one case, a German family prepared to commit suicide. They had witnessed the mass rape of their neighbors. They saw no other way out. But a Soviet officer intervened. He did not hurt them. He showed compassion. He promised them protection. In another instance, a group of soldiers attacked a girl in front of her father. Suddenly, other Soviet soldiers stepped in. They stopped their comrades. A local mayor from Breslau struggled to understand this duality. He wrote, "One has to have experienced it. Frame 1. A Russian soldier gives his last piece of bread to a hungry German child. Frame 2. A Russian truck driver voluntarily picks up an elderly mother with a broken cart. Frame 3. These same men set up ambushes in cemeteries. They wait for unaccompanied girls. They rob and rape them." Experts looked for an explanation. They compared the behavior of the Red Army to primitive children, capable of extreme kindness, capable of ruthless cruelty. Peter Bloch lived through the first weeks of occupation in Kleinmachnoe. He summarized the occupiers' nature. They were unpredictable, brutal like the Huns, innocent like children. You never knew where you stood. They could calmly shoot a civilian. They could rape a woman. And then, 5 minutes later, they could hand a chocolate bar to a child. They could stand in front of a rabbit stall, laughing and admiring the animals. It was a terrifying disconnect, and it was the most accurate description of the Soviet soldier in 1945. Junior Sergeant Radkina saw it all. She was a telephone operator, but her eyes recorded the horrors of the front line like a camera. One image remained burned into her memory forever. A German woman. She lay on the cold ground, completely naked. Between her legs, a live hand grenade. The sight was gruesome. Radkina felt nothing at the time. Why did she feel no pity? Because war kills empathy first. Years later, the shame would come. But in that moment, the Soviet soldiers lived by a different code. Feelings shifted with the wind. One day, rage. The next, emptiness. Months passed. The battalion settled into a routine. Then, 5 German girls arrived at the commander's post. They were weeping. Their clothes were torn. The unit's gynecologist performed an examination. The verdict was clinical and brutal. Irregular wounds, severe internal injuries. Their underwear was soaked in blood. They'd been raped all night long. The commander did not hesitate. He ordered the entire battalion to assemble. The visual suggestion. The camera captures hundreds of soldiers standing in rigid formation. Dust covers their boots. Their faces are unreadable. We formed up. The officers brought the 5 girls forward. The order was simple. Look at them. If you recognize anyone, point them out. We will shoot them on the spot. Rank does not matter. The square went silent. The soldiers waited for the verdict. But the German girls sat on the earth and cried. They looked at the rows of armed men. They shook their heads. "We don't want more blood," they said. They refused to identify their tormentors. The execution was called off. Instead of bullets, each girl received a loaf of bread. At first glance, an act of mercy, but in reality, total exhaustion. Was it easy to forgive? Radkina asked herself this for decades. She looked at the German towns, intact houses, white walls, tiled roofs, roses blooming in the gardens. Her own home was a pile of ash. She wanted to hurt them. She wanted to see their tears. It was impossible to suddenly become kind. To return to humanity would take dozens of years. This was the paradox of war. But in Berlin, there was no time for philosophy. The survival tactics of women in wartime Berlin became an art form. The devastating bombings ended. The street fighting ceased. A new threat emerged from the smoke: the hunt. Bewildered, drunk soldiers roamed the ruins. Rape became a daily terror. German women took immediate countermeasures. They declared war on their own beauty. The footage shows women smearing soot and thick dirt onto their cheeks. They rub ash into their hair. They cut their hair short with dull scissors. They put on men's trousers. They wore 3-4 layers of ragged clothing to appear shapeless, to look bulky, to look repulsive. If disguise failed, they used biological warfare. A woman would scream typhus or syphilis when a soldier approached. No matter how drunk the attacker was, the fear of disease was a sobering slap. They knew the risks. They backed away. But the most common tactic was invisibility. The city went underground. Women spent weeks in damp basements, coal chutes, and attics. They only moved when necessary. They memorized the patrol schedules. Some sought refuge in houses occupied by the elderly or children. They hoped the soldiers would respect the old. Hunger eventually forced them out. When they moved in packs. They believed safety in numbers would deter a lone attacker. If that failed, they opened their wallets. Bribery became the language of the streets: a gold watch, a wedding ring, a hidden stash of food. Women traded family heirlooms for 5 minutes of safety. They appealed to decency. They negotiated with predators. Communities organized their own defense. In the frame, makeshift barricades blocking a cellar door, piles of furniture and rubble. Women organized watch shifts. One slept, one watched. A whistle or a shout gave the group seconds to hide or prepare to fight. But there was another strategy, the most controversial one. If you cannot hide from the pack, find a wolf to protect you. German women began to seek out high-ranking officers, majors, colonels, captains, men with stars on their shoulder boards. These men had authority. They could command the lower-ranking soldiers to back off. The deal was transactional: consensual sexual relationships in exchange for food and protection. The victims became manipulators. A diary found in Berlin tells the story. An anonymous woman, April and May, 1945. She had already survived a series of brutal assaults. She slammed her fist on the table. "Damn it!" she exclaimed. She made a cold calculation. She needed a powerful man, an officer. As soon as she could walk, she went out. She practiced Russian phrases. She checked her reflection. Was she too miserable to be attractive? She stopped being prey. She started hunting for a protector. Sometimes, genuine affection grew from these arrangements, but mostly it was just survival. Thus ended the illusion of peace. 1.9 million. That is the estimated number of German women raped by Soviet soldiers during and after the war. Some tried to use this to their advantage. They established relationships with individual soldiers, hoping for protection. It was a desperate calculation to deter violence, but the strategy often failed. The fear of sexual assault became a permanent part of daily life under occupation. In Berlin alone, the scale of the tragedy is difficult to verify. Some reports estimate 20,000 victims. Others suggest figures ranging from 100,000 to nearly 1 million. It wasn't just a single event. Many women were attacked multiple times. The injuries were severe. Some sources claim that up to 10,000 women died as a direct result of these assaults. The brutality extended far beyond the capital. It reached every corner of Germany. Women of all ages were targeted without exception. But survival was only the first challenge. Why did the Ministry of the Interior break its own strict laws? Abortion was illegal and heavily policed, but the magnitude of unwanted pregnancies forced the state's hand. The authorities had no choice but to acknowledge the crisis. They suggested the creation of special wards in large cities. One such ward opened in the Neukölln district of Berlin. The archives here tell a grim story. Records show a sharp vertical increase in abortion requests. Between June 7, 1945 and June 17, 1946, the Health Office approved exactly 995 cases. The cause was listed simply rape. The footage shows overcrowded waiting rooms with peeling paint and exhausted nurses. Doctors worked under impossible conditions. Supplies were low. Electricity was intermittent. At first glance, a unified medical effort, but in reality, a strange alliance of enemies. Most of the staff were anti-fascists, newly appointed by the occupation authorities. But they couldn't handle the workload alone. Former members of the Nazi Party were brought in. These doctors had been suspended from private practice. Yet, in the wards, their skills were deemed essential. But the paperwork revealed the horror. To get a procedure, women had to provide detailed statements. They had to explain their circumstances in writing. These affidavits often mixed desperate social need with the lingering rhetoric of racial hygiene. One woman wrote about a rape that occurred on April 27, 1945. She requested an abortion for practical reasons. She already had an illegitimate child. She lived with her parents. Her siblings were small. There was simply no space for another life. Another file details an attack on the road to Potsdam. The woman stated she was single. Her situation was isolated. Her mother had been dead for 15 years. Her father was half Jewish, and she had not seen him in 6 years. She explained that bringing a child into the world under these conditions was impossible. There was no turning back for these victims. On August 20th, 1945, another woman submitted her plea. She had been raped on her way to work during the second day of Easter. She identified her attacker as a Mongol. Her letter described the abuse and the resulting pregnancy with intense disgust. She stated clearly, she could not carry the pregnancy to term. It would lead to her own death. Her existing children would be left motherless. Mothers with large families faced the same dilemma. One applicant had 3 children between the ages of 5 and 11. Her husband was a former soldier. He had not returned from the front. She had been bombed out twice. She had fled from West Prussia in January. Another woman was attacked on her commute. She described a struggle with a Mongol soldier. She resisted, but the assault was completed. Now pregnant, she sought help for one reason: to prevent her living children from losing their mother to suicide or starvation. The camera records, glass vials and rusting medical instruments on a metal tray. The legacy of the campaign wasn't just trauma, it was disease. Venereal infections spread rapidly among the victims. Doctors like Anne-Marie Durand-Weber returned to work at a first aid station in the ruins of Berlin. She focused on testing women and girls. Gonorrhea and syphilis were rampant. Durand-Weber noted that the crisis did not end with the surrender. Rapes, diseases, and mass abortions continued well into 1946. The medical system had to mutate to survive. The spike in abortions served as a statistical marker for the violence. The records from Neukölln and other health offices remain as evidence. They document the widespread suffering and the frantic efforts to provide relief. The war had ended for the soldiers, but for these women, the battle for survival continued. Thus ended the illusion of peace. 2 million victims. That is the estimated number of German women raped by Soviet soldiers at the end of the war. The testimonies are terrifying. They describe unleashed fury and animal violence. There is no justification for these crimes. But a question remains. Why did the soldiers of the Red Army do it? It seemed like simple savagery, but the root cause was deeper. What forces a human being to become a monster against the defenseless? The answer is not simple. It requires looking back. 1 year earlier, summer 1944. The location is Ukraine, the Yanovska concentration camp. Red Army troops broke through the gates and liberated the facility, but the Germans were already gone. They left behind a landscape of death. The smell hit the soldiers first. It was the heavy, sweet stench of decaying flesh. Microclouds of flies buzzed over the ground. The footage shows sandy ditches surrounding the camp perimeter. Bodies were everywhere. The Germans had no time to hide the evidence. They simply piled the corpses into narrow trenches and threw loose sand over them. Limbs stuck out from the earth. The soldiers moved closer. They inspected the dead. Hands were tied behind backs with wire. Skulls had shattered from point-blank bullet holes. Something else caught their attention. Locks of hair, tufts of women's hair lay scattered across the graves. The guards had dragged the women by their heads to the execution pits. But this was only the beginning. Survivors emerged from the barracks. They were skeletal, barely alive, but they wrote testimonies. Russian archives preserve these papers today. One name appeared constantly: Oberfuhrer Wilhaus, the camp commander. Wilhaus did not just kill. He played. He sat on the balcony of his house with his wife. They took turns shooting rifles at prisoners working in the yard below, target practice on live humans. But the archives reveal a darker detail. Wilhaus often ordered guards to grab toddlers. They threw the children into the air. Wilhaus shot them before they hit the ground. His 9-year-old daughter watched. She clapped her hands and screamed, "Daddy, again, again!" The Soviet command did not hide these facts. They weaponized them. Propaganda machines went into overdrive. Every soldier in the Red Army saw the photos of the graves. Every platoon heard the stories of the murdered children. Political officers gathered the troops. They read the reports aloud. Newspapers printed one message: kill the Germans. Radio broadcasts demanded vengeance for the Hitlerites. It was a calculated psychological operation. The goal was to create a mindset of absolute hatred. Events accelerated. The army moved west. With every kilometer, the soldiers found more pits, more bodies. They found their own people. Girls as young as 16, kidnapped from Russian villages, enslaved. These girls cried in the arms of the soldiers. They whispered details of their stolen youth and constant abuse. The survivors were too weak to hold a weapon, but the dead in the shallow graves screamed for revenge silently. Then came the border. The Red Army entered East Prussia, German soil. The landscape changed instantly. At first glance, a picturesque paradise, but in reality, the target, the camera records, white stone houses, manicured gardens, clean streets. There was no ruin here. The civilians lived comfortably. They had not seen the starving children or the burning villages of the East. It was a stark contrast to the scorched earth left behind in the Soviet Union. The soldiers looked at the clean windows and white fences. They remembered the flies at Yanovska. The rage boiled over. The Soviet leadership had taught them that the entire German population was guilty. There were no innocents here, only the enemy. Collective punishment became the unofficial law. The soldiers gripped their rifles. They were determined to make everyone pay. There was no turning back. 50 kilometers a day. That was the speed of the Soviet advance into Germany. The front line moved so fast that the rear guard could not keep up. Logistics crumbled. Communication lines snapped. In this chaotic gap, the chain of command disintegrated. Why did the commanders look away? It seemed they had a duty to maintain order, but the military objective was higher than the moral one. Berlin had to fall. Everything else was secondary. Officers studied maps, ignoring the smoke rising from the villages behind them. They needed aggressive troops, not polite ones. As a result, the soldiers realized a simple truth: there would be no punishment. Then came the alcohol. It wasn't just a drink, it was fuel for the violence. Warehouses filled with industrial spirit, abandoned wine cellars captured crates of schnapps, entire units drowned themselves in liquor. The footage shows soldiers stumbling through the streets, bottles in hand, uniforms unbuttoned. Drunkenness stripped away the last layers of human restraint. It acted as a chemical trigger. Inhibitions vanished, aggression spiked. A drunk soldier with a loaded submachine gun became an unpredictable force of nature. They didn't just loot, they smashed windows, burned furniture, and hunted for victims. But it got worse. Alcohol was only the catalyst. The root cause was buried 4 years deep. Consider the psychological timeline: 1,400 days of continuous slaughter. These men had survived Stalingrad. They had seen their friends torn apart by artillery. They had marched over frozen corpses outside Moscow. The constant proximity to death altered their minds. At first glance, a victorious army, but in reality, a legion of traumatized survivors. They were desensitized. Blood was no longer shocking. It was routine. Killing was not a crime, it was a reflex. This profound trauma made it dangerously easy to inflict pain on the German population. The soldiers had been hollowed out by the war, leaving only hardened shells capable of extreme brutality. We must remember the nature of this conflict: total annihilation. The war in the East followed no rulebook. The Geneva Convention did not exist here. Social norms had evaporated in the fire of the scorched earth tactics. The logic was absolute: destroy the enemy completely. In this vacuum, the worst human instincts surfaced. Primal impulses took over. Propaganda had called for revenge. Experience had taught them cruelty. Alcohol removed the brakes. The chaotic environment provided the opportunity. These factors did not just add up, they multiplied. The desire for material gain mixed with a thirst for vengeance. The result was a wave of atrocities that swept across the conquered territories. Discipline was dead. Absolute silence from the Kremlin. That was Joseph Stalin's official response to the accusations of mass sexual violence in Germany. During the war, the Soviet leadership refused to acknowledge the reports flooding in from the front. They constructed a rigid narrative. The Red Army soldier was a liberator. He brought freedom to the enslaved peoples of Europe. He was the moral superior to the fascist beast he had slain. Admitting to widespread rapes would have destroyed this propaganda instantly. So, the reports were buried. Moscow dismissed the accounts as enemy lies. They claimed it was a psychological operation designed to rot the Soviet victory from the inside. Why did the commanders look away? It seemed like a breakdown of discipline. But the explanation was often darker. Revenge. A narrative took hold in the barracks. After years of Nazi atrocities on Soviet soil, burning villages, executions, starvation, violence against Germans was seen as payback. It was framed as inevitable behavior in the chaos of a ruined world, but this was only the official line. On the ground, the reality was different. Military authorities could not ignore the scale of the chaos. Prosecutors opened files, investigations began. If a soldier was suspected of rape, the machinery of justice, however rusty, started to turn. The process was brutal. The victims, usually German women, were forced to enter the military zones. They had to look their tormentors in the eye. The footage shows a trembling woman stands before a lineup of dirty, exhausted infantrymen. Soviet archives detail one specific case that illustrates the horror. A group of soldiers had brutally assaulted a young German girl. The command did not sweep it under the rug. They brought the accused forward. The officers demanded the girl identify the culprits. Fear is visible in the descriptions of the event. She was traumatized, surrounded by foreign uniforms. Yet, she raised her hand. She pointed them out. There was no long trial. The superiors acted immediately. The punishment was severe. In many cases, execution. The sound of a firing squad volley echoed against the brick walls. This harshness was not born of empathy. It was a cold calculation. It served as a deterrent. The goal was to show that the army would not dissolve into a mob, even in the ruins of the Reich. At first glance, a unified, conquering force, but in reality, a fractured army. Not every soldier participated in the crimes. Many were disgusted. They believed the integrity of their unit was at stake. They did not want the actions of a few criminals to tarnish the victory of the majority. These soldiers took justice into their own hands. They did not wait for tribunals. They confronted the rapists behind the barracks. Physical violence was the primary tool. Fists, rifle butts, and boots. They beat their comrades to teach them a lesson in honor. Events accelerated. German women also sought retribution. Despite the danger, many marched to the commandant's offices. They demanded the attackers pay for their crimes. It required immense courage to walk into the headquarters of the occupying force and demand justice. But the obstacles were immense. The chaos of the battlefield made consistent justice nearly impossible. Units moved daily. Witnesses vanished. In the frame, stacks of unread complaints gathering dust on a wooden table. Fear silenced thousands. Victims were afraid of being judged. They feared no one would believe them. The military environment was strictly patriarchal. Many Soviet officers were reluctant to take the accusations seriously. They viewed the women as the enemy, not as victims. This reluctance stalled investigations before they could begin. It got worse. Soldiers who tried to report their comrades faced retaliation. They were accused of betrayal. Commanders labeled them as troublemakers, causing division within the ranks. This pressure forced many to stay silent. Yet, some persisted. Driven by a sense of duty, they continued to report the crimes. They fought a war on two fronts, against the German army and against the breakdown of order in their own platoons. These files reveal the grim complexity of justice in war. It was a constant struggle between maintaining discipline and facing the harsh reality of human cruelty. The war for justice had no clear winner. 1945 marked a turning point. The war formally ended, and the chaos of the front lines began to settle into the rigid structure of occupation. But a new problem emerged on the desks of Soviet commanders. Reports of rape were piling up. Thousands of complaints flooded the headquarters. These were not just isolated incidents. They were a stain on the reputation of the self-proclaimed liberating Red Army. The leadership in Moscow realized that unchecked violence was becoming a political liability. It threatened to destroy any hope of future Soviet-German cooperation. Why did the Kremlin finally react? It wasn't purely out of mercy. It was out of necessity. The Presidium of the Supreme Soviet issued a harsh directive. They raised the stakes. Rape was reclassified as a severe crime against the state. The punishment was brutal, 10 to 15 years in a hard labor camp. For a soldier used to the front, the gulag was a fate worse than death. High-ranking officers received strict orders. Discipline had to be restored at any cost. In the city of Magdeburg, the commander did not wait for tribunals. He caught soldiers in the act. He didn't arrest them. He lined up the regiment on the parade ground. The offenders were dragged out in front of their comrades. The sound of firing squads echoed through the barracks. The executions were public. This was a message written in blood. The Soviet leadership wanted every soldier to understand that the time of total lawlessness was over. Political officers held daily lectures. They spoke of the honor of the socialist warrior and the duty to protect the civilian population. Propaganda posters appeared on walls, demanding respect for the locals. But words were not enough. Physical separation began. At first glance, a simple redeployment, but in reality, a quarantine. Commanders ordered troops out of German homes. Soldiers were moved into isolated barracks or fenced-off military camps. In some regions, the engineering corps evacuated entire villages. They created clean zones where only military personnel could exist. This reduced the chances for soldiers to cross paths with German women. Freedom of movement was revoked. To leave the base, a soldier now required a paper pass. A written authorization signed by a superior officer was the only way to visit a German house. Patrols checked documents at checkpoints. Caught without a pass, the penalty was severe. Yet, the system had cracks. Enforcement was inconsistent. Some commanders ran a tight ship, checking every bunk and every pass. Others turned a blind eye. The post-war environment was still a mess of ruins and confusion. The archives show officers struggling with widespread alcoholism. Drunkenness was the fuel for the fire. Cheap vodka and looted wine circulated freely among the ranks. A drunk soldier rarely listened to orders about socialist honor. Alcohol broke down the discipline that Moscow tried so hard to build, but the violence was not contained within the borders of Germany. The dark side of liberation stretched across the map. German women were not the only victims. In Hungary and Romania, the scenario repeated itself. These nations had allied with Hitler, and the retribution was swift. The scale of sexual violence there mirrored the horrors seen in Berlin. However, the Red Army did not stop at enemy borders. Late 1944. The Soviet offensive rolled into northern Yugoslavia. Technically, this was friendly territory. Yugoslavia was an ally in the fight against fascism. But the soldiers did not distinguish between friend and foe. The political map changed, but the behavior of the troops did not. Diplomacy meant nothing to a soldier with a gun. One bullet to the back of the head. That was the potential price for a Soviet soldier caught raping a woman in Yugoslavia. Moscow had issued strict commands. The Red Army was told to see the Yugoslavs as brothers, not enemies. Propaganda posters showed Soviet soldiers shaking hands with partisans. Officers read orders aloud before every march. Respect the traditions, respect the families. But did these orders work? At first glance, the statistics were lower than in Germany. But in reality, the violence never stopped. Tito, the communist leader of Yugoslavia, did not stay silent. He sent furious telegrams to the Soviet command. He detailed the assaults. He demanded justice. The Soviet reaction was harsh. The archives contained grim records. Soldiers were stripped of their ranks. Some were sent to the freezing vastness of the Gulag. Others faced a firing squad right there in the field. The sound of the execution volley served as a message to the entire platoon. An officer who assaulted a local woman could be executed in front of his own men. It was a brutal deterrent. Yet, many crimes went unreported. The suffering of families continued behind closed doors. But the Soviets were not unique. The map of Europe was stained by every army that marched across it. The myth of the clean war of the Western Allies is just that, a myth. American, British, and French soldiers also left a trail of trauma. June 1944. American boots hit the beaches of Normandy. The liberation began. But for many French women, the nightmare had a new face. GI propaganda painted French women as sexually available. Soldiers saw them as easy prey. The command turned a blind eye. They blamed French society for the moral looseness. When the reports piled up on desks, the leadership found a scapegoat. They targeted African American soldiers, prosecuting them with disproportionate severity. It was a cover-up based on race. But this was only the beginning. As the U.S. Army crossed into Germany, the restraint vanished completely. The advance was rapid. The violence was frantic. In April of 1945 alone, 37 soldiers were convicted of rape. But convictions were rare. The reality was much darker. The medical reports described the brutality. women beaten until they lost consciousness, victims subjected to forced oral and anal penetration. There was no mercy for age. The youngest victim was 7 years old, the oldest was 69, 14,000. That is the estimated number of rapes committed by American soldiers in Western Europe. Most occurred in Germany, and the National Archives suggest the real number is buried even deeper. British soldiers joined in. They claimed the German women were willing. They spoke of consent, but the bruises on the victims told a different story. It was an assertion of power over the defeated. Then came the French. In Stuttgart, chaos reigned. The footage from the era shows French troops moving through the ruined streets, but behind the walls, panic spread. April 1945. The French army occupied the city. Soldiers were billeted directly in civilian homes. There were no barracks to separate them. The proximity was dangerous. German women were treated as war trophies. Hundreds of reports flooded the local police stations. The French military authorities did little. Like the Americans, they blamed their colonial troops from North and West Africa. It was a convenient lie. Nazi propaganda used these rumors to stoke racism, but the Allies used them to deflect blame. This was the unwritten law of the war. Soldiers viewed women as spoils. Their bodies became battlefields. Military authorities minimized the crimes to protect the image of victory. German women, already living in the rubble of their cities, had to endure this final humiliation. The trauma did not end with the peace treaty. It remained, a scar on the soul of a continent. Two million women became victims of violence in 1945. That was the hidden cost of the Third Reich's collapse. Why did the German population freeze in terror? It wasn't just guilt, but the realization that the propaganda was becoming reality. Goebbels had spent years painting the Soviets as subhuman monsters. He warned of destruction and death. Now, the Red Army was actually crossing the border. They were driven by 4 years of brutal warfare and a thirst for revenge. They remembered their own burning villages. The footage shows white sheets hanging from every window in Berlin. It was a sign of total surrender. The German civilians offered no fight. The Wehrmacht was shattered. Most fighting-age men were dead, captured, or missing. Only the vulnerable remained in the ruins. Elderly men, terrified children, and millions of women. Violence spread through the occupied zones like a plague. It wasn't just random attacks, it was systemic. But when the Soviets opened medical centers to treat venereal diseases, the waiting rooms remained empty. The women stayed away. Rumors circulated through the breadlines. People whispered that these clinics were traps. At first glance, a place for medical help. But in reality, a recruitment center for the gulags. Fear defied logic. Women believed that a diagnosis meant deportation to Siberia. They preferred the physical pain of untreated disease to the risk of forced labor in the snow. They suffered in silence behind locked doors. There was no turning back. Resistance was non-existent. The population was exhausted. The Nazi regime had evaporated, leaving them with nothing to fight for. And the Soviet NKVD made sure it stayed that way. They didn't just patrol the streets. They conducted sweeps. They kicked down doors at midnight. Anyone suspected of hostility disappeared into unmarked cars. But hope took a strange, desperate form. The war myth took hold. Germans convinced themselves that the alliance between the USSR and the West would collapse immediately. They waited for American tanks to push back the Soviets. This fantasy made them passive. They sat in their ruined homes and waited for a rescue that never came. Daily life became a game of survival. Women altered their entire existence. They stopped washing their faces to look less attractive. They wore rags. They never went out after dark. The sound of boots on the staircase caused panic. The camera records, a family dead in their kitchen, slumped over the table. Suicide rates spiked. It wasn't just an impulse, it was a calculated decision. Mothers gathered their children. They turned on the gas taps. They swallowed cyanide capsules, anything to escape the inevitable violence. An atmosphere of absolute insecurity ruled the cities. But this was only the beginning. The physical wounds healed, the psychological scars festered for decades. Shame became a national condition. Victims felt guilty for their own survival. They buried the trauma deep inside. Speaking about it was impossible. Society did not offer comfort, it offered judgment. Communities shunned victims, neighbors turned their backs. The stigma of sexual violence isolated women from the very support networks they needed. They were left entirely alone. It got worse. 9 months later, the children were born. They were labeled Russenkinder. In the archives, their files are often marked illegitimate. These children grew up as living reminders of the defeat. They were bullied in school. Mothers looked at them and saw the faces of the enemy. Many were abandoned to state orphanages. The trauma fractured families. Husbands returned from prisoner of war camps years later. They found strangers instead of wives. The men felt emasculated. They had failed in their primary duty to protect their families. This powerlessness turned into anger. It turned into silence at the dinner table. The traditional family structure, idolized by the Nazis, collapsed completely. Trust was dead. People looked at their neighbors with suspicion. The sense of community that had survived the bombings disintegrated under the occupation. Everyone was a potential informant. Everyone was a rival for food. Germany retreated into millions of private shells. The national identity shifted. Germans began to see themselves not as perpetrators, but as victims. The Soviet violence was interpreted as collective punishment. This allowed them to sideline their own guilt for the Holocaust. They focused on their own suffering. This narrative fueled resentment toward the East that lasted for half a century. 70 years have passed. The footage shows flags waving over the Reichstag and soldiers celebrating. The world remembers the victory. It remembers the end of fascism. But the witnesses are almost all gone. The women who paid the price carried their secrets to the grave. Their story is not about military strategy. It is a testament to the enduring, silent wreckage of war. Thus ended an era.